Hello and welcome back to another evening. Get comfortable wherever you are tonight. If you're already settled in, lights low, the day beginning to release its grip on you, then you are exactly where I want you to be for this one. Tonight we are going to spend some time with Dexter Morgan, not with the kills, not with the plot mechanics or the procedural details or the seasonal rankings. We have covered all of that in other videos, and we will cover more of it in future ones. Tonight we are going somewhere quieter and I think more interesting. We are going to look at the philosophy underneath Dexter, the questions the show was genuinely asking underneath everything about identity and morality and trauma, and what it means to be human when you are not entirely sure that you are. I want to say something before we begin, because I think it matters. This is not a takedown. I love Dexter. I have loved it for a long time, and everything I'm going to say tonight comes from that place. What I want to do is take the show seriously. To treat Dexter Morgan not just as a fictional serial killer in a procedural drama, but as a philosophical thought experiment that ran for 8 seasons and then came back for more. To ask what the show was actually thinking about underneath the blood and the dark humor and the Miami skyline, because here is what I believe and what I want to spend tonight exploring with you. Dexter Morgan is one of the most philosophically complex characters in American television. He is simultaneously a utilitarian and a Kantian, which is a contradiction he can never resolve. He is a psychopath who loves, a monster who follows a code, a man who was told who he was before he ever had the chance to find out. And underneath all of it, he is someone asking the oldest question in philosophy: can I be good, and what does good actually mean? Let that question settle for a moment. We are going to take our time with it tonight. No rush, settle in. The dark passenger can rest. The hollow place inside. Dexter as existentialist. The very first thing Dexter Morgan ever says to us in the first scene of the first episode is a confession. Not a confession of guilt, exactly, more a confession of condition. He says in that quiet, almost clinical internal voice that becomes the sound of the entire show that he does not know what made him the way he is. But whatever it was, it left a hollow place inside. People fake a lot of human interactions, he tells us, but he feels like he fakes them all, and he fakes them very well. And that is his burden, he says. That is his burden, he guesses. That monologue is so familiar to anyone who has watched the show that it might be easy to move past it without sitting with it. But I want to sit with it tonight because it is doing something philosophically significant. Dexter is not describing himself as evil in that opening. He is not describing himself as a predator or a monster or a man possessed. He is describing himself as hollow, as someone performing a life he cannot actually inhabit, as someone whose relationship to the entire human world is one of mimicry rather than membership. That is the existentialist condition, stated plainly and almost without drama in the first 90 seconds of the show. Existentialism, as a philosophical tradition, is built around a few core ideas. The universe does not provide meaning inherently. Existence precedes essence, as Sartre famously put it, meaning that you are not born with a fixed nature or a predetermined self. You become who you are through your choices, your actions, your engagements with the world. There is no cosmic blueprint. There is no essence waiting to unfold. There is only the accumulation of what you do and choose and refuse. This is a liberating idea for most people who encounter it, at least initially. If nothing is fixed, then anything is possible. You are not bound by what you were born as or who you were told you were. You can become. For Dexter, it is a source of profound confusion rather than liberation, because Dexter has been told with great specificity and from a very young age exactly what he is. His adoptive father, Harry, looked at him and saw a damaged child with violent compulsions and made a decision. He named what Dexter was. He gave it a framework. He built a code around it. And from that moment forward, Dexter has been living inside someone else's definition of him, which means that the existentialist question, the one Sartre puts at the center of the examined life, has never really been available to Dexter. He has not been free to become. He has only been free to perform. Jean-Paul Sartre, writing in the middle of the 20th century, described what he called bad faith. It is the condition of living as though your identity is fixed, as though you have no choice, as though the role you are playing is the only thing you are capable of being. A waiter who is so committed to being a waiter that he has disappeared into the role. A person who says, "I cannot help it. This is just who I am," in order to avoid the terrifying responsibility of choosing differently. Dexter lives in bad faith, but his version of it is more layered and more sympathetic than Sartre's classic examples. He is not pretending to be trapped because it is easier than facing his freedom. He was told he was trapped before he was old enough to know what freedom might look like. Harry gave him the code when Dexter was still a child. The identity of Dexter Morgan, vigilante killer who only kills killers, was constructed around him before he could participate in the construction. And yet the show keeps circling back to the question of whether Harry was right, whether Dexter is simply what Harry said he was, or whether something else might have been possible if the diagnosis had never been made. It is a question the show never fully answers, and I think that ambiguity is one of its greatest strengths. What we can say with confidence, because the show shows us directly, is that Dexter does not experience himself as free. He experiences himself as driven, pulled, occupied. The internal monologue, which is the show's most distinctive structural choice, gives us access to a mind that is constantly narrating its own behavior from a slight distance, as though watching itself from somewhere just outside. He describes himself going through motions. He describes observing his own performance as though it belongs to someone else. He is, in philosophical terms, alienated from himself. The blood slides are, in this reading, the one authentic element of Dexter's life. Everything else is performance: the job, the apartment kept in precise order, the social smile, the relationship with Rita and the children, the conversations with Deborah at crime scenes and in her apartment and over bad coffee. All of it is calibrated, maintained, surveilled by Dexter's own watchful interior eye. But the blood slides, kept hidden behind the air conditioning unit in his apartment, never shown to anyone, never useful for anything practical. Those are the one thing that belongs entirely to him. Not to Harry's code, not to the performance of normal. They are proof that the ritual was performed, held privately, for no audience. In a life lived almost entirely for external eyes, even Dexter's own, the blood slides are the closest thing he has to an inner life that is simply his. This matters because one of the central projects of existentialist philosophy is finding what is genuinely yours in a world that is constantly pressing its categories and definitions and expectations onto you. Sartre called this the project of authentic existence. It is not about being good or being virtuous. It is about being honestly and fully what you actually are, rather than what the world tells you to be. It is about taking responsibility for the self you are actually constructing, moment by moment, through the choices you actually make. Dexter never achieves authentic existence in the philosophical sense. He does not even seriously try for most of the series. But the show asks quietly and persistently whether authentic existence is even possible for someone who was defined before he could speak, shaped before he could choose, named before he could name himself. There is something genuinely melancholy about that question when you sit with it. Because Dexter is not unique in having been given a self before he had the chance to find one. Most of us receive significant portions of our identity from outside before we are equipped to evaluate what we are receiving. The family expectations, the cultural definitions of what a good person looks like, the religious frameworks and the class assumptions and the gender scripts. Dexter's version of this is extreme, and it involves a great deal of violence. But the underlying condition of living inside a self you did not fully author is not unique to fictional serial killers. The show understands this, I think, which is why Dexter is sympathetic in a way that should not logically be possible. We recognize the hollowness he describes. We recognize the performance. We recognize the gap between what is shown and what is felt. His version of that gap is monstrous, but the gap itself is human. I don't think the show answers the question of whether a different origin could have produced a different Dexter. I think it just keeps asking it across 8 seasons and multiple reboots and trusts us to sit with the not knowing. And there is something genuinely valuable in that, even in a show full of dark rooms and plastic wrap and blood on tile floors. There is a concept in Heidegger's philosophy called Throness, and I think it is the most useful philosophical idea for understanding Dexter's situation. More useful even than Sartre's bad faith, which assumes a freedom that Dexter's particular origin makes complicated. Throness is Heidegger's term for the fundamental condition of finding yourself already in a world you did not choose. with a body you did not choose in circumstances you did not choose, with a history you did not author. You are thrown into existence. You did not arrive by careful selection. You arrived at a particular moment in a particular place in a particular condition, and all of that arrives before you have any capacity to do anything about it. Most people's thrownness is relatively ordinary. You are thrown into a specific family, a specific culture, a specific economic situation, a specific body with its specific capacities and limitations. These things shape you before you can shape yourself. This is Heidegger's point. Being human means always starting from a position that was established before you got there. Dexter's thrownness is catastrophic. He is thrown into a shipping container, into his mother's blood, into 2 days of sensory horror that his 3-year-old nervous system cannot process. He is thrown into the specific hands of Harry Morgan rather than any of the other possible caregivers who might have responded to what they found in him differently. He is thrown into the code before he can evaluate whether the code is the right container for what he is. Every significant feature of who Dexter Morgan becomes is established before Dexter Morgan has any agency over the establishment. And yet Heidegger's full argument is not that thrownness eliminates responsibility. It is that authentic human existence means taking ownership of your thrown situation, working with it honestly rather than denying it or pretending it is other than it is. The thrown situation is the starting point. What you do from the starting point is still yours. Dexter almost never does this. He does not take ownership of the code in Heidegger's sense. He does not own the kills as choices he makes from his thrown position. He treats the code as given and the dark passenger as the driver and his own agency as something more like a moderating influence between the two. He is perpetually in the position of someone who received their existence rather than someone who is, even imperfectly, authoring it. The moments when this changes are rare and worth noticing. The late-season conversations with the hallucinated Harry, where Dexter begins to acknowledge that the dark passenger is not separate from him, are the moments where something like Heideggerian authenticity becomes possible. Where Dexter begins, tentatively and with tremendous resistance, to stand in his own thrown situation and acknowledge it as his. Whether he ever fully arrives there is one of the questions the franchise is still working through. Before we move on, if you're finding this a comfortable way to wind down tonight, a subscription is always appreciated. It is completely free, and it genuinely helps the channel keep growing. The Code of Harry, morality as constraint versus morality as identity. Harry Morgan makes a decision that most people, presented with the same situation, would not make. He is a police officer, a good one by most accounts. A man who has spent his career enforcing the law, working within the system, catching criminals through legitimate institutional means. And he has adopted a boy who, by the time Harry really understands what he has in his house, is clearly going to become a killer. The dog buried in the backyard, the animal graves that contained more than one set of bones. The pattern that Harry, as a law enforcement officer, recognizes with a clarity that might have been easier not to have. The conventional response to this discovery, the legal response, the institutional response, would be to get the child into psychiatric care, to notify the appropriate authorities, to treat what is manifesting in young Dexter as the serious clinical problem it almost certainly is. Harry does none of this. Instead, he looks at his damaged, brilliant, violent child and he builds a framework. He constructs a set of rules designed to take the thing Dexter is going to do regardless and make it, in Harry's careful estimation, at least defensible, at least directed, at least aimed somewhere that produces less harm than the alternative. He calls it the code, and the code has 2 foundational rules. Dexter must never be caught, and Dexter may only kill people who are guilty of murder beyond any reasonable doubt, people who have slipped through the legal system and remain free to kill again. It is worth pausing on this decision for a moment because it is philosophically extraordinary. Harry is essentially arguing, before Dexter has killed anyone as an adult, that the correct response to a child's violent compulsions is not treatment or suppression, but direction. He is saying that the violence is going to happen, and the question is not whether to prevent it, but how to aim it. He is making a consequentialist argument. The outcome, he believes, will be better if Dexter has a code than if he does not. Society will be safer. The people Dexter kills will deserve to be killed. The net calculation will come out positive. Consequentialism in moral philosophy holds that the rightness of an action is determined entirely by its outcomes. The good consequences of an act are what make it morally correct. Harry's logic, dressed in consequentialist clothes, goes something like this. Dexter will kill. Killers who escape the legal system cause further harm. If Dexter only kills those killers, the net result is more good than if he kills randomly or if he is institutionalized and then released to the world without structure. Therefore, the code is the morally optimal solution. It is a coherent argument on its own terms. And the show, for most of its run, treats it as at least partially valid. The people Dexter kills are generally people who have done terrible things and evaded consequence. The world of the show is safer in a narrow technical sense for their absence. But Harry's code has a Kantian structure underneath the consequentialist justification, and this is where it becomes philosophically troubled. Immanuel Kant, writing in the 18th century, argued that moral actions must be based on universal principles that apply regardless of circumstances or outcomes. He called this the categorical imperative. Act only according to principles that you could will to become universal laws. Treat people always as ends in themselves, never merely as means to your own purposes. The code mimics Kantian structure in that it is absolute. It does not bend for circumstance or convenience. Dexter must follow the rules even when breaking them would be easier or more satisfying. He must have confirmed guilt before he kills. He must not be caught. These are presented as inviolable. In that sense, Harry has built a rule-based moral system, which sounds Kantian. But here's the problem. Kant requires that moral action be self-legislated. The moral worth of an act comes precisely from the fact that you chose it through your own rational reflection, that you are the author of the principle you are following. Dexter did not author the code. He was given it by someone else before he was old enough to understand what was being given. He follows a moral framework he did not choose, for reasons he was provided rather than reasons he discovered through his own reflection. He is the least Kantian in television history. This might seem like a minor philosophical quibble, but I think it is the key to understanding why the revelations about Harry, when they come, hit Dexter with the force they do. Because if the code's moral authority derives from Harry, and Harry turns out to be compromised, then the code is compromised with him. The first major blow comes in Season 2, and it comes through Captain Matthews, who reveals to Dexter the truth about how Harry died. Not heart disease, as Dexter had been told throughout his life, a deliberate overdose, a suicide. And the real reason, is that Harry saw what he had created. He walked in on Dexter 3 days before his death and found him preparing a body, dismembering it with the efficiency and calm of someone doing work they are practiced at. And Harry understood, in that moment, viscerally and undeniably, that the code had not contained the darkness or redirected it towards something defensible. It had simply organized it, made it more efficient, more precise, more sustainable. Harry had not saved Dexter, he had trained him. He had looked at a traumatized child, and rather than seeking to heal the trauma, he had built a structure around it and called the structure justice. And he could not live with that understanding. He died 3 days later. Dexter's response to this revelation is one of the most quietly devastating moments in the series. He has spent his entire adult life trying to make Harry proud, to honor the code as a tribute to the man who made it. The code is not just a set of rules to Dexter, it is a relationship. It is a form of ongoing communion with a father he lost. And now he learns that the father who made it died in horror at what he had made. The moral framework he has lived inside, the structure that gives his life its only coherence, was abandoned by its own architect. And yet the code survives this revelation. Dexter does not throw it out. He keeps following it, even after Harry is revealed as a man who could not face his own creation, which tells us something important. By the time of that revelation, the code is no longer Harry's, it is Dexter's. The scaffolding has become the building. The imposed structure has become the actual self, or at least the only self Dexter knows how to be. The second major blow comes in Season 8 with Dr. Evelyn Vogel, a neuropsychiatrist who specializes in psychopathy. Vogel arrives in Miami and reveals something that changes the origin story entirely. She helped Harry design the code. She was there at the beginning, contributing the clinical expertise that shaped the rules. It was not, as Dexter had always understood it, a father's desperate love for a damaged child finding its own solution. It was a clinical intervention co-designed by a psychiatrist who studied psychopaths and was interested in whether their violence could be directed towards socially beneficial ends. The code was an experiment. Dexter was the subject. This revelation should be catastrophic, and in some ways it is. But what is philosophically interesting is that it lands with less force than the news about Harry's suicide did. Because Dexter, by season 8, has been following the code for decades. It does not matter anymore whether it was love or science that created it. It is his. He has no other self to return to. The code is the shape of his life. To discard it would not be liberation, it would be dissolution. That is the tragedy of the code of Harry. It was built to manage Dexter. It ended up replacing him. There is a parallel worth drawing here between the code of Harry and the concept of a superego, as Freud described it. The superego is the internalized voice of parental and social authority, the part of the psyche that monitors behavior, generates guilt, enforces compliance with the rules of the family and the culture and the broader world. It is not identical with morality in any deep sense. It is the moral voice you were given before you could develop a moral voice of your own. Harry's code is, in this reading, a deliberately constructed superego. Harry literally built the voice that monitors Dexter's behavior, set the criteria for guilt, established the enforcement mechanisms. He engineered what psychoanalysis would describe as a natural developmental process, the internalization of parental authority into a governing internal structure, and he engineered it with a specific purpose and a specific set of rules. What Freud observed about the superego is that it can be more severe, more demanding, and more punishing than the actual parent who gave rise to it. The internalized voice becomes more rigidly demanding than the original external voice ever was, because the internal version has no access to the flexibility and situational judgment that the external version had. It just has the rules. This is exactly what happens to the code as Dexter carries it across decades. Harry was capable of nuance. Harry made situational judgments. Harry could see Dexter as a specific person in a specific situation and respond to the specific reality in front of him. The code, as Dexter carries it internally, cannot do any of this. It is the rules, and only the rules, and the rules apply regardless of what is actually in front of him. It becomes more demanding and more rigid the further it gets from the man who made it. This rigidity protects Dexter in some ways. It prevents the code from expanding the way Miguel Prado's version expanded. But it also means that the code cannot evolve with Dexter as he changes. It cannot accommodate what he actually learns about himself across the seasons. It stays fixed while everything around it shifts. Settle in, there is more to cover, and we have all the time we need. The Dark Passenger, Determinism, Free Will, and the Self You Didn't Choose. There is a moment in season 8 of Dexter that I keep returning to because I think it is the most philosophically honest moment in the entire run of the show. Dexter is speaking with the hallucination of Harry, the internalized version of his adoptive father that has narrated and guided and questioned him across decades of kills and choices and near misses. And Harry says something that cuts through every rationalization Dexter has ever constructed. He says, "If there is no dark passenger, then you are responsible for everything you have done." And Dexter, for just a moment before he retreats into argument and deflection, goes very quiet. The dark passenger is the name Dexter gives to his compulsion, the urge to hunt, to prepare, to kill. He treats it, for most of the series, as a kind of occupant, something that rides in him rather than something that is him. In the second season, during the Narcotics Anonymous meetings he attends as a cover story but speaks in with surprising honesty, he describes it in almost exactly this way. There is something dark in him. When the dark passenger is driving, he feels alive. He uses the driving metaphor directly and deliberately. He is in the car, but something else is behind the wheel. This is not a casual choice of language. The dark passenger serves a specific psychological function for Dexter, and that function is the distribution of moral responsibility. If the compulsion to kill exists in him as a separate entity, if it is a passenger rather than a part of him, then Dexter the person is not fully accountable for what Dexter the body does. The dark passenger is responsible for the kills. Dexter is just along for the ride. Philosophers have a name for this kind of move. It is called exculpatory determinism. The argument that because your actions were caused by forces outside your control, You cannot be held fully morally responsible for them. Dexter's dark passenger is his version of this argument, made not in a philosophy seminar but in the privacy of his own interior monologue. He was made this way by what happened in the shipping container. The trauma created the compulsion. The compulsion drives the kills. He is, in this framing, more victim than villain. The shipping container is, in the show's mythology, the origin of everything. Dexter was 3 years old when his biological mother, Laura Moser, was murdered in a brutal and specific way by 3 men who had been caught in a drug deal. She was a police informant working for Harry Morgan. The men killed her and left 2 small boys sitting in the pooled blood for approximately 2 days before Harry found them and pulled them out. This is trauma so severe and so early that calling it formative barely captures it. The show treats the shipping container as Dexter's ground zero, the event from which everything else follows. And it is precisely this origin that gives the dark passenger its persuasive force, both for Dexter and, frankly, for the audience. It is very difficult to hold a 3-year-old accountable for what he becomes after 2 days in his mother's blood. But the show, and this is one of its genuine philosophical achievements, refuses to let that reasoning stand unchallenged. The most direct challenge comes from Brian Moser, the ice truck killer who is revealed in the first season finale to be Dexter's biological brother. Brian was in the same shipping container, he witnessed the same massacre, he sat in the same blood, he was pulled out of the same horror and processed by a different set of systems into a different kind of adult. And Brian became something different from Dexter, not better in any obvious sense. Brian's murders are without code, without structure, without the kind of moral framework that Dexter at least attempts to maintain. But the point is not that Brian is worse than Dexter. The point is that the same origin produced 2 different people. If the shipping container fully determined what either of them was going to become, then it should have made them the same. It did not, which means the container does not fully determine the destination. Something else was happening in the years between the container and adulthood. Choices were being made or not made. Paths were being taken or avoided. The origin is real, and the trauma is real, but origin is not destiny. This is the philosophical position known as compatibilism, and I think it is the position the show is actually defending, even if it never states it directly in those terms. Compatibilism holds that free will and determinism can coexist. You can be genuinely shaped by forces entirely outside your control, your genetics, your trauma, your environment, your early relationships, and still be the author of your choices in a meaningful and morally significant sense. The shaping is real. The freedom is also real. They are not in competition with each other. Dexter was shaped by the container. He was also shaped by Harry. He was also shaped by every choice he made across 40-odd years of living about who to target and when and how and whether to feel anything about it. He is not simply a product of his circumstances. He is a complicated interaction between his circumstances and his choices, and the complication is precisely where his moral responsibility lives. The Season 8 conversation with hallucinated Harry makes this explicit in a way that the show had been building toward him for years. Harry points out in that late-season dialogue that Dexter invented the term dark passenger himself. Harry gave him the code. The dark passenger was Dexter's own contribution to the mythology of himself. He created the concept that has allowed him to displace responsibility onto an interior passenger, and he created it when he was approximately 12 years old, young enough that Harry let it go without challenging it, not wanting to force a child to carry more than he could carry. But the show is clear by Season 8 that the dark passenger is not a separate entity. It is Dexter. It is the part of Dexter that wants to kill, the part that feels alive during the ritual, the part that chooses every time to go through with it rather than stop. There is no passenger, there is only Dexter with his full and complicated history, making choices that belong entirely to him. The compatibilist reading of Dexter also has implications for how we understand the code itself. If Dexter is genuinely free in the compatibilist sense, then the code is not simply an external constraint imposed on him by Harry. It is a choice he keeps making, continuously, every time he follows it rather than abandoning it. Every kill that adheres to the code is Dexter choosing the code. Every time he declines to kill someone who does not meet the criteria, he is exercising the freedom the compatibilist position insists he has. This changes the moral profile of the code significantly. If Dexter has no meaningful freedom, the code is just the shape of his determinism. If he has compatibilist freedom, the code is something closer to a genuine moral commitment, imperfect and externally originated, but sustained by something that functions like choice. The Season 5 arc with Lumen Pierce supports this reading. Lumen's darkness, her need for the specific form of justice the legal system cannot provide, is not something Harry's code covers. The code was designed around Dexter's specific compulsion and his specific situation. Helping Lumen is not code-prescribed behavior. It is something Dexter chooses on grounds that go beyond the code, something more like genuine moral judgment, an assessment that what happened to Lumen was wrong and that he is in a position to help address it in a way that no institutional resource can. This is the most morally interesting thing Dexter does in the series. It is also, for Harry's code taken strictly, a violation of principle. He is acting outside the code's explicit boundaries for reasons that are not about the dark passenger and not about the structure Harry built. He is acting from something that looks more like conscience than compulsion. The philosopher Christine Korsgaard, writing about practical reason and what she calls the sources of normativity, argues that we act morally not because of external rules or internal compulsions, but because we can reflectively endorse certain principles and commit to them as genuinely ours. By this account, Dexter's decision to help Lumen is a moral high point not because it is code compliant, but because it is the point at which something like reflective endorsement becomes visible in him. He has chosen this from reasons he can identify, for goals he can articulate, in a way that goes beyond the pattern Harry installed. It does not last. By Season 8, the code has reasserted its dominance, and the question of genuine moral agency has retreated again into ambiguity. But it was there, briefly, in Season 5, and the show was honest enough to show us what it looked like. This is, in the end, a scarier idea than the dark passenger, because it means there is no one else in the car. It means the road Dexter has been traveling is the road he built. The destinations he has reached are the destinations he chose. The damage along the way is his to own. And it also means, which is the more hopeful philosophical implication, that different choices were always at least theoretically possible. The dark passenger did not make Brian Moser and Dexter Morgan identical, even from the same origin. Something in each of them, some combination of circumstance and decision, and who happened to shape them in the years after the container, made them different. The determinism is real, but it is not total. And in the gap between the determinism and the total, which is where human life actually happens, there is responsibility. Dexter spends most of the series refusing to stand in that gap. By Season 8, the show is asking him to stand in it anyway. The performance of normal, authenticity, masks, and the social self. Dexter is one of the most skilled social performers in television history, and the show has the structural ingenuity to let us watch him perform from the inside. This is the genius of the internal monologue. We are not watching Dexter's social performance and interpreting it from the outside, the way his colleagues at Miami Metro do. We are hearing him narrate the performance as he conducts it. We hear him note that this is the moment where he should look concerned, so he arranges his face into concern. We hear him calculate that a normal person would ask a follow-up question here, so he asks one. We hear him assess with the cool efficiency of someone running a complex operation, whether the performance is landing or whether adjustments are needed. It is an extraordinary narrative device, and it does something philosophically important beyond simply establishing character. It forces us to ask constantly whether there is anything behind the performance, whether somewhere underneath the narrated approximation of normalcy, there is a real Dexter at all. The sociologist Irving Goffman, writing in 1959, argued that all social interaction is a kind of performance, that we all maintain what he called a front stage, the self we present to others in social settings, and a backstage, the self we are when no one is watching, when the performance is suspended, and something less managed is allowed to exist. He was writing about ordinary people living ordinary lives. He was not imagining fictional serial killers. But Dexter is his thesis taken to its furthest possible extension. For Dexter, the front stage is everything. The blood spatter analyst who makes dry jokes in the break room and remembers which colleagues prefer their coffee with sugar and shows up reliably and gets along with almost everyone in a way that produces neither close friendships nor obvious enemies. the devoted adoptive brother who shows up when Deborah calls, the reliable boyfriend who does the right things at the right times and says the right things at the right moments, the capable father who packs lunches and attends school events and reads bedtime stories. Every element of this front stage is calculated, calibrated, and sustained through conscious effort. It does not arise naturally. He tells us it does not arise naturally. Every smile is preceded by a decision to smile. His backstage, the self that exists when no one is watching and the performance can stop, is the kill room. The plastic wrap laid with care over every surface, the photographs of what the victim has done pinned to the wall, the kit arranged in a fixed order that never varies. That is where the narration about what a normal person would do stops, and Dexter simply does what he does. In existentialist terms, the question of authenticity is the question of which of these is the real Dexter. Is he the performance, with the kill room being the aberration? Or is he the kill room with the performance being the aberration? Is either of them more truly him than the other? Sartre's answer, which I think the show implicitly endorses, is that this is the wrong question. Authenticity is not about uncovering some true self that exists underneath the social performance, some essential core that was there before any of the shaping happened. Sartre does not believe in that kind of essential self. Authenticity, for Sartre, is about taking responsibility for what you actually do, for the choices you actually make, for the consequences you actually produce in the world. The authentic person is not the one who drops all masks. The authentic person is the one who owns their actions without excuses, without deflection, without attributing responsibility to a dark passenger or a code or anything external to themselves. By that definition, Dexter spends most of the series in profound inauthenticity. He deflects responsibility onto Harry, onto the code, onto the dark passenger. He performs rather than chooses. He follows rather than decides. He is, in Sartre's terms, in bad faith, but a particularly elaborate and sympathetic version of it. And yet there are cracks in the performance, and the show uses them with care. The most important crack is Deborah. With almost everyone else in his life, Dexter is performing to some degree. The calibration is always running. The assessment of whether the response is landing is always active. With Deborah, the performance slips. Not into honesty, not into transparency about what he actually is, but into something less calculated. He is not measuring the emotional distance to Deborah the way he measures it with everyone else. He is not deciding in advance how much concern to register or how to position his face for maximum plausibility. He is actually genuinely present with her in a way that he is not present with anyone else. She sees him laugh without him manufacturing the laugh. She sees him angry in a way that does not have a social purpose. She sees him scared in ways that he cannot completely control or conceal. These moments are not performance. They are something else, and they are the closest Dexter comes, for most of the series, to anything like an authentic relationship. When Deborah discovers his secret in the season 6 finale, when she walks into a church and finds him in the middle of killing Travis Marshall, the moment the performance ends completely and permanently with the one person who matters most, the show stages it as a kind of liberation that is also a catastrophe. She sees him. Not the blood spatter analyst, not the devoted brother, not the man who always shows up when she calls. She sees the kill room version, and the weight of that seeing on both of them carries the entire 7th season and everything that follows it. There's a question worth letting drift with you tonight as you settle in. Not a question with an easy answer, just one worth holding gently. How much of what any of us show the world is really us? How much of anyone's social self is performance, calibration, the arrangement of the face into the appropriate expression for the appropriate moment? Goffman thought the answer was that all of it is performance to some degree, that the front stage and backstage distinction runs through every life and not just the lives of people with dramatic secrets to hide. Dexter's version of this is extreme and literal and involves a great deal of plastic wrap. But the underlying condition, the gap between the self we present and the self we are when no one is watching, is not unique to him. It is the condition of being a person in a social world. Dexter just happens to narrate it out loud. And in doing so, he makes visible something that most of us keep quietly invisible, which is perhaps one of the more uncomfortable things the show does if you let it. The season 6 storyline, which centers on the Doomsday Killer investigation and Travis Marshall's religious motivation for murder, is interesting philosophically in a way that goes beyond its specific plot. Travis Marshall is a religious zealot who believes he is enacting the will of God, staging elaborate apocalyptic tableaux based on the Book of Revelation. He is, in his own mind, not a murderer but an instrument. The violence he does is not his. It is the violence of divine command. Filtered through him, the show sets Travis Marshall directly against Dexter in a way that emphasizes their structural similarity. Both men perform a version of normal social life, in Travis's case, a working relationship, and what appears to be a mentorship that conceals a completely different private reality. Both men have internalized a framework that authorizes their violence as something other than ordinary murder. Both men are performing constantly a self that is not the whole self. But the show is also careful to distinguish them. Travis Marshall believes his authorization comes from God. Dexter's code has no divine component. It is entirely human in its origin, designed by a police officer and a neuropsychiatrist, grounded in evidence and criteria rather than revelation. Travis follows a voice he believes comes from outside reality. Dexter follows a voice that came from his father, and he knows it came from his father. This distinction matters philosophically because it is the difference between heteronomy, doing what you do because an authority external to yourself commands it, and a more complicated relationship with an internalized authority that you know was constructed by specific people for specific reasons. Dexter is not following divine command, he is following Harry command. And knowing the origin of the command, even if you follow it anyway, changes the quality of your relationship to it. Travis Marshall cannot question his authorization because questioning it would require questioning God. Dexter can question his authorization, he just usually does not. Take a breath, we have covered a lot of ground so far, and we're going to slow down even further from here. The Trinity Killer and the Mirror. What Arthur Mitchell taught Dexter. Dexter spends most of the first 3 seasons looking for something he cannot name precisely. He is not looking for victims exactly, he has plenty of those, and the code provides a reliable supply. He is looking for something more specific and more personal, some evidence that the life he is living is sustainable, that a person can carry the darkness he carries, and still have something around it that resembles, from a reasonable distance, a normal human existence. He thinks, briefly and catastrophically, that he finds that evidence in Arthur Mitchell. Arthur Mitchell is the Trinity Killer, and he is, in terms of the show's overall quality and philosophical depth, the high point of the original series. John Lithgow plays him with a quiet, devastating authority that is unlike anything else in the show's run. On the surface, Arthur Mitchell is a pillar of his community. He runs a church group. He organizes volunteer construction work that builds homes for those in need. He has a wife, 2 children, a house in the suburbs, a life of apparent decency and social contribution. He teaches high school and leads the 4 Walls, 1 Heart charitable home building organization. He is, to all visible surfaces, a good man. He has also killed in a precise 3-part pattern, a pattern so specific it became the basis for his FBI designation as the Trinity Killer for more than 3 decades, and no one has ever suspected him. Dexter discovers Mitchell's identity before anyone at Miami Metro does, and then, rather than killing him as the code requires, he waits. He observes. He follows Mitchell through his ordinary days and watches for the seams, trying to understand how Mitchell has accomplished what Dexter himself most wants to accomplish, which is to integrate a violent secret life into a survivable domestic one, to be, in the world's eyes, a family man, a professional, a person of standing, to carry the darkness without it touching everything else. This is philosophically significant because what Dexter is doing in the early weeks of season 4 is looking for a moral exemplar. In Aristotle's virtue ethics, a moral exemplar is someone whose character and conduct demonstrate what a well-lived life looks like in practice. You do not learn virtue by reading abstract principles about it. You learn it by observing people who have the virtue, living alongside them, gradually coming to resemble them through sustained engagement with who they are. The exemplar teaches by existing rather than by instructing. Dexter is applying this framework in the worst possible direction to Arthur Mitchell. He wants to learn from Arthur the way an apprentice learns from a master. He wants to observe the technique of surviving as what they both are and bring that technique back to his own life. What he discovers over the course of the season is that Arthur Mitchell, is not a master of anything. The domestic life that appears to represent successful integration, the family meals and the church attendance and the home building projects, is not a sanctuary from the darkness. It is another arena where the darkness operates, with different tools and a slower timeline. His wife is controlled, frightened in a way that has become habitual over decades, so habitual that it no longer registers to her as fear, but simply as the texture of being married to Arthur. His children have grown up in the shadow of his temper and his secrets. His son carries the damage with a visible weight. His daughter carries it differently, with a kind of brittle competence that is its own form of damage. The house in the suburbs is not a proof that a person can sustain a family while living a parallel violent life. It is evidence that the violence expands to fill every space it is allowed to occupy. And Arthur has allowed it to occupy everything. Arthur Mitchell is not someone who has found a way to carry evil without it spreading. He is someone who has spread it everywhere he has ever been, and ensured that the people closest to him were too damaged or too frightened or too isolated to say anything about it to anyone who might help. In Aristotle's framework, a moral anti-exemplar shows you what you must not become. Arthur functions as the negative model Dexter was looking for a positive one. He shows Dexter exactly what Dexter will become, what any person becomes, who stops maintaining the boundary between the darkness and the life built around it. The darkness does not stay in its designated space. It does not remain in the kill room. It moves through every relationship and every space and every conversation, slowly and completely, until there is no room left that it has not entered. And the most important and most costly thing about this lesson is that Dexter does not receive it in time. He keeps watching Arthur instead of killing him. He keeps finding reasons to wait, to observe one more week, to gather one more data point about how Arthur manages the integration. He tells himself this is investigation. He tells himself this is research. But the real reason is simpler and harder to face. Killing Arthur would mean giving up the hope that Arthur represented. It would mean accepting that the life Dexter wants, the integrated domestic life with a family and a career and a secret that stays contained, does not exist anywhere. That there is no model for it. That the code is not a sustainable solution to the problem of being what he is. It is just a set of rules that makes the damage slightly more directed while the underlying reality continues to expand. Dexter kills Arthur Mitchell in the season 4 finale. In a bomb shelter kill room he sets up after a frantic chase, after months of observation and delay. It is a clean kill, code compliant. And then he drives home to surprise his wife Rita and his family. He finds Rita's body in the bathtub, murdered by Arthur Mitchell in the hours before Dexter caught him. He finds his infant son Harrison sitting in the pooled blood on the bathroom floor. This is the show completing a loop with the precision of a surgical incision. Dexter's origin is a shipping container, a mother murdered, a child sitting in the blood. His catastrophic delay in killing Arthur Mitchell, the delay caused by the hope that Arthur offered a model for surviving as what he is, has recreated his own origin trauma in his own home for his own child. The thing he most wanted to prevent has arrived in the room where it was least expected, carried there by his own hesitation. Arthur Mitchell does not teach Dexter what Dexter hoped he would teach him. He teaches him something else entirely, at a cost that cannot be undone. You cannot study darkness without it reaching you. Proximity to something terrible makes you responsible for what it does next. The hope of learning something useful from a monster is just another way of being in business with one. Season 4 of Dexter is, among other things, a meditation on the cost of delayed clarity. On what it costs to keep looking for evidence that a hard truth might not be truths, when the evidence was available weeks or months ago and you simply could not face what it meant. Can a psychopath love? The neuroscience and philosophy of Dexter's emotional life. In Season 8, Dr. Evelyn Vogel says something to Dexter that is designed to be unanswerable. She has asked him to explain what he loves about his sister, Deborah. He gives his answer. He loves having meals with her. He loves that she was always there for him. He loves the way she used to look up to him when they were younger. And Vogel says, with the precision of someone who has spent her career studying exactly this question, that none of those things are about Deborah. They are about what Deborah does for Dexter, what she provides him, what she represents to him. Selfless love, she tells him, love that is genuinely organized around the well-being of another person rather than around what that person offers you, is difficult enough for typical people. For psychopaths, she believes, it is not possible. A psychopath's notion of love is not the same thing as love. It is a devastating argument. The show presents it with genuine conviction through a character who is clinically credible and professionally experienced and clearly not trying to wound Dexter for its own sake. Vogel is not being cruel. She is being clinical. She believes what she is saying, and she has spent decades developing the grounds to believe it. And yet, the show immediately begins complicating Vogel's certainty through everything it shows us about what Dexter actually does in relation to the people he is supposed to be incapable of loving. Consider the Lumen Pierce arc in Season 5. Rita is dead. Dexter is grieving in whatever way Dexter grieves, which is internally and at a slight distance from himself, as always. He encounters Lumen, a young woman who survived being kidnapped and assaulted and nearly killed by a ring of men who had been operating in Miami for years. She is traumatized, rageful, unable to return to a normal life until the men who hurt her face some form of justice that the legal system cannot provide. Dexter helps her. He helps her track the men down. He helps her through each stage of what she came to Miami to do. He takes on enormous personal risk to do this. There is no strategic benefit to him in any of it. Lumen does not protect his secret. She does not make his life easier or safer or more convenient. She makes it considerably more complicated and considerably more dangerous. And when the thing she needed to do is finally done, when her darkness, as Dexter calls it, her dark passenger fades, and she is no longer in Miami's orbit, he lets her go. He does not try to hold her. He does not make her leaving about himself or his needs. He simply, quietly lets her leave and wishes her something like peace. That is not the behavior of someone constitutionally incapable of other-directed concern. Or consider the Lagarda situation in Season 7 and everything that follows from it. Deborah shoots Maria Lagarta in the shipping containers to protect Dexter from arrest. She crosses an irreversible moral line because she loves her brother. And Dexter, who benefits entirely from this act, who is protected by it, who would have been arrested and exposed without it, watches across the entirety of Season 8 what this choice does to Deborah. He watches her drink too much. He watches her make choices that hurt her. He watches the cost of what she did for him accumulate in her, daily, visibly, at close range. And he cannot fix it. He has no tool for that kind of repair. If Dexter were simply incapable of genuine concern for others, the deterioration of Deborah would not register in him as the moral weight that the show clearly intends it to carry. The guilt he carries around her spiral is not the kind of guilt he manufactures to fit in with what a normal person would feel. It is the quiet, heavy, unresolvable kind that does not have a social purpose. The philosophical question, and I genuinely do not think there is a clean answer available, is whether love requires a particular kind of interior experience or whether it is defined by a pattern of action. If love is primarily an inner state, a particular quality of feeling toward another person, then Vogel may be right that Dexter does not love in that sense. He does not describe his feelings in those terms. He does not have the vocabulary for it. When he tries to articulate what he feels for the people he cares about, the articulation is always slightly off, slightly too instrumental, slightly organized around what those people do rather than who they are. But if love is defined by what you do, by the choices you make and the risks you accept, and the losses you carry for the sake of another person, then Dexter's relationship with Deborah qualifies, fully and without much ambiguity. He has organized significant portions of his life around her. He has made real and costly choices that had her well-being at their center. He has done things that produced no benefit to him and considerable risk, because she was involved and her involvement changed the calculation. The philosopher Harry Frankfurt, in his work on love and the organization of the will, argued that to love something or someone is to organize your will around their flourishing, to make their well-being genuinely important to you in a way that shapes what you choose and what you refuse. By Frankfurt's definition, Dexter loves Deborah. The will organization is there in his behavior, even if the interior emotional vocabulary to name it is not. Vogel's clinical certainty describes what psychopaths typically cannot feel. It may not fully describe what they cannot do. And the show is honest enough to hold that distinction open rather than resolve it cleanly in either direction. Can Dexter love? Probably not in all the ways the word usually implies, probably not with the full interior warmth that most people mean when they use that word, but in the ways that can be seen and measured and lived in actual relationship with another person. The evidence is complicated enough that the question does not close. And I think the show earns that ambiguity. It does not want to tell you that Dexter is secretly a warm and loving person underneath all the darkness, that the real Dexter is just waiting to be uncovered. It also does not want to tell you that he is simply a clinical void going through the motions of connection with complete interior emptiness. It wants to hold you in the uncertainty between those two poles, the way real relationships with real complicated people often hold you in uncertainty that does not resolve. Let that sit with you for a moment. We are past the halfway point tonight, and from here we slow down even further. If you're still comfortable, a subscription always helps the channel continue doing exactly this kind of thing. There is another dimension to the Arthur Mitchell arc that I think deserves attention, and it is the one that makes Season 4 philosophically richer than any other season of the show. It is the question of what Dexter wants from Arthur that he cannot get from the code alone. The code tells Dexter what to do. It does not tell him how to feel about what he does. It does not address the loneliness of being the only person in the room who knows the whole truth about who he is. It does not provide companionship in the specific and irreducible sense of being known by someone who understands from the inside rather than just tolerating from the outside. Dexter's initial hope in Arthur Mitchell is not purely practical. He is not simply looking for a technique he can copy. He is looking for evidence that someone like him can be, in some sense, not alone. That the radical isolation his secret produces is not inevitable. That two people who carry the same kind of darkness can recognize each other and find in that recognition something that functions like connection. This hope is the most human thing about Dexter's Season 4 arc, and it is the thing that makes his delay in killing Arthur not simply a strategic error, but a comprehensible expression of need. He wants what almost all people want in some form, which is to be seen by someone who does not look away. Arthur Mitchell appears briefly to be that person, someone who could see Dexter and recognize him and not require the performance. What Dexter discovers too late is that Arthur Mitchell cannot see anyone but himself. His narcissism is so total and so long established that genuine recognition of another person, even another person who is like him, is not available to him. He would have recognized Dexter as a tool or a threat. He would not have recognized him as a companion in the specific sense Dexter needed. This is the loneliest revelation in the show. Not that Arthur's a monster. Dexter knew Arthur was a monster. But that the loneliness Dexter has been trying to address through his observation of Arthur is a loneliness that Arthur could not have addressed even if Arthur had been willing to try. The problem is not that Dexter has not found the right person to be known by. The problem is that being known in the specific way Dexter needs to be known requires honesty that he cannot offer and a self that he cannot fully access. The examined life, as Socrates defined it, requires a self stable enough to examine. And Dexter, after decades of performing rather than being, may not have one of those available. There is another dimension to the Arthur Mitchell arc that I think deserves attention, and it is the one that makes Season 4 philosophically richer than any other season of the show. It is the question of what Dexter wants from Arthur that he cannot get from the code alone. The code tells Dexter what to do. It does not tell him how to feel about what he does. It does not address the loneliness of being the only person in the room who knows the whole truth about who he is. It does not provide companionship in the specific and irreducible sense of being known by someone who understands from the inside rather than just tolerating from the outside. Dexter's initial hope in Arthur Mitchell is not purely practical. He is not simply looking for a technique he can copy. He is looking for evidence that someone like him can be, in some sense, not alone. That the radical isolation his secret produces is not inevitable. That two people who carry the same kind of darkness can recognize each other and find in that recognition something that functions like connection. The examined life Socrates recommended requires a self stable enough to examine. And Dexter, after decades of performing rather than being, may not have one of those available. The vigilante paradox. Justice, morality, and who gets to decide the fundamental premise of Dexter, the one that makes it possible to root for him across multiple seasons of a show that should by any logical measure produce only horror and revulsion, is that he only kills people who deserve it. This premise does an enormous amount of moral work on the show's behalf, and it is worth examining carefully because what it is actually asking us to accept is a private individual's right to determine guilt and execute punishment without oversight, without due process, without appeal, and without the possibility of being wrong in a way that can be corrected. In political philosophy, that is one of the most dangerous ideas there is. Thomas Hobbes, writing in the 17th century in the aftermath of the English Civil War and the social dissolution it produced, described what he called the state of nature, the condition of human life before governments and laws existed. In the state of nature, without any sovereign authority to enforce agreements and punish violence, everyone was in permanent competition with everyone else, and the strong simply took from the weak whenever it was in their interest to do so. Life in this condition was, in his famous phrase, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. The social contract, the agreement by which people submit to a governing authority in exchange for protection and stability, exists precisely to escape this condition. You give up certain freedoms, including the freedom to do whatever you want, including the freedom to punish your own enemies according to your own judgment, in exchange for the protections that come from living under a stable and impartially enforced legal system. Dexter has functionally opted out of this agreement. He has kept the benefits, the police badge that gives him access to databases and crime scenes and investigative resources he would not otherwise have, the legal protection that covers his movements through the world, the social order that allows him to live and work and maintain a life without constant threat. He enjoys every benefit the social contract produces, and he has withdrawn from the most fundamental obligation of the contract, which is to surrender the individual right to judge and punish. He is taking from the commons while exempting himself from contributing to it in the most basic way. John Locke, a somewhat more optimistic political philosopher writing in the same era, acknowledged that individuals in the state of nature do have a legitimate right to punish those who violate the natural law. Justice, on Locke's account, is not originally the exclusive property of governments. It belongs to everyone in the absence of a governing authority. But Locke also argued clearly that this individual right to punishment is precisely what we give up when we form civil society. The moment a legal system exists, the individual's right to personally administer justice is superseded. You have agreed, by participating in and benefiting from the legal order, to delegate that function to the state. Dexter's implicit argument, the one his entire existence makes without him ever needing to articulate it, is that the delegation to the state has failed in specific cases and the original individual right therefore reverts. That the legal system, through corruption and technicality and resource limitation and human error, allows people who have forfeited their right to live to continue living and continue harming. That someone has to fill the gap. He is not overthrowing the social contract. He is supplementing it in the cases where it has provably broken down. It is a coherent argument. And for most of the series, the show is generous enough to allow it to function as such. The people Dexter kills are guilty. The system has genuinely failed to stop them. The net result, within the show's logic, is fewer dangerous people in the world. And then comes the Miguel Prado arc in Season 3, and the coherence begins to fracture. Miguel Prado is an assistant district attorney, intelligent, charming, ambitious, well-regarded, and, as it emerges gradually over the season, deeply corrupt in ways that have been expertly hidden beneath his professional success. He discovers Dexter's secret and pushes for a partnership. He believes in what Dexter is doing, he says. He wants to be part of it. He wants to work alongside someone who can actually deliver the justice that the system he has spent his career in keeps failing to deliver. Dexter allows a version of this cautiously and against his better judgment because the idea of not being entirely alone in what he is, of having someone who understands rather than someone he is perpetually concealing himself from, has a pull that the code does not fully account for. And almost immediately, Miguel begins to expand the definition of who deserves to die. A defense attorney he dislikes for personal reasons, a political rival who represents a professional threat, a person who has simply been inconvenient to his ambitions. He applies the code's framework to people who do not remotely meet its criteria because the code's framework is, When held by someone without Dexter's specific psychological history and investment in following it precisely, just a story a person tells himself about why his kills are acceptable. It is a rationalization structure, and rationalizations can be expanded. This is the practical demonstration of why vigilante justice cannot be extended or shared. One person with a self-imposed code produces outcomes that are idiosyncratic and probably unjust in ways the code holder cannot see, but at least relatively contained within the limits of that specific person's specific psychology. Two people with loosely shared codes and different underlying motivations and different definitions of what counts as deserving produce something far more dangerous, because the definition of deserving will expand to accommodate whatever each person needs it to accommodate. Dexter kills Miguel before the corruption spreads further, but the point has been made. And then there is Lagerta. Maria Lagerta is not corrupt. She is not dangerous. She is not a murderer who has slipped through the legal system. She is a careful, politically sophisticated, genuinely competent detective who follows evidence with a thoroughness that the show treats with respect throughout the series. In Season 7, she reopens the Bay Harbor butcher case. She finds inconsistencies in the evidence that framed James Dokes. She develops the correct theory about who the real butcher is. She pursues this theory through entirely legitimate and methodologically sound means, doing exactly what the position she holds requires her to do. She is right about Dexter. The show makes this clear. The system, working as it is supposed to work through one careful and persistent investigator who refuses to accept the convenient conclusion, has produced the correct result, and she is killed for it. Deborah shoots her in the shipping containers to protect Dexter, and the show stages this not as a relief or a victory, but as horror. We do not feel good about Lagerta's death. We feel the weight of what it represents. A good person, doing her job correctly and well, killed because the person she was investigating has become too embedded in the lives of the people who should have brought him to account. This is the show's clearest philosophical statement about vigilante justice. The problem with supplementing the system privately is that the system, when it eventually arrives at the correct conclusion, will be right. Lagerta was right. The system produced the correct answer, and the vigilante framework required that the correct answer be suppressed permanently at the cost of an innocent life. There is no good answer to this. The show does not pretend there is. There is another figure in the Bay Harbor butcher investigation whose philosophical significance is usually under-examined in conversations about Dexter, and that is James Dokes. Dokes is the one person at Miami Metro who has always known that something is wrong with Dexter Morgan. Not what is wrong, not the specifics, but the wrongness itself. He has been tracking it from the first season with a certainty that makes everyone around him uncomfortable. Because Dokes does not have evidence, and he does not have a theory, and he cannot articulate what he is seeing in a way that the institution around him can act on. He simply knows. In the end, he is right. His instinct was correct from the beginning. The thing he could see but not name, the thing that made everyone around him dismiss his suspicion as personal animosity or professional jealousy, was real. He was looking at a serial killer, and he knew it before anyone else knew it, without the advantage of any specific evidence. Dokes is framed as the Bay Harbor butcher in Season 2, through a sequence of events that begins with his discovery of Dexter's true nature and ends with Lila West, Dexter's unstable sponsorship connection at the time. Blowing up the cabin where Dokes is being held captive, he dies. His reputation is permanently destroyed. The case is closed. And the person who is actually right about everything receives the worst possible outcome for having been right. This is the show's clearest illustration of an idea from the philosophy of justice called epistemic injustice. The concept, developed by philosopher Miranda Fricker, describes the specific harm done to someone when they are not given credibility as a knower. When someone has true beliefs and is dismissed not because their beliefs are wrong, but because of who they are or how they are perceived. Dokes has the correct theory. He cannot make anyone believe him because his reputation for hostility toward Dexter has made his claim seem personal rather than professional. The deeper injustice is that Dokes pays with his life and his legacy for being right. He is not simply disbelieved, he is posthumously framed as the monster he was trying to expose. The actual criminal keeps working. The person who identified the criminal takes the criminal's fall. There is no philosophical framework that makes this just. The show does not offer one. Dokes is simply right, and right in Dexter's world is not sufficient protection. Harrison and the inheritance of darkness. Trauma, parenting, and moral transmission. The question the show has been building toward, from the moment in the Season 4 finale where a baby named Harrison is found sitting in his mother's blood on a bathroom floor, is whether darkness can be inherited. Whether what happened in the shipping container, what happened to Dexter, can happen again through different circumstances and a different generation to his son. New Blood, the limited series that premiered in November 2021, takes this question seriously in a way the original series was not quite ready to in its own time. Harrison is now a teenager, played by Jack Alcott, and he has found his way through a series of circumstances the series fills in gradually, to the small upstate New York town of Iron Lake, where Dexter is living under the name Jim Lindsay, working at a sporting goods store, hunting deer, maintaining the appearance of a man who has made peace with a smaller, quieter, less eventful life. Harrison arrives carrying damage that is both similar to and different from Dexter's. He did not witness a massacre at age 3 in any fully conscious sense, but he grew up without a father in a succession of foster situations, knowing at some level that his father's absence was not ordinary absence. Something was different, something was not being said. He has been hurting himself, the series reveals, cutting his legs in a methodical and patterned way. The cutting is not random, it is too precise for that. It is controlled in a way that suggests someone who has, at some level, discovered that a particular kind of pain, administered in a particular kind of controlled way, produces a particular kind of relief, and anyone watching the show carefully will recognize the dynamic. The same relationship to the controlled infliction of pain, the same quality of ritual around it, connects Harrison's self-harm to Dexter's kill table in a way the show intends to be noticed. Dexter sees this. He sees the cutting. He understands what it means, or at least what it might mean. And then he does something that should disturb us more than it perhaps initially does, in the first rush of feeling something recognizable as relief at having his son back. He considers giving Harrison the code. He considers doing to his son exactly what Harry did to him. Taking the darkness, identifying it, building a framework around it, making it survivable by making it directed, channeling the compulsion rather than suppressing it, because suppression, Harry believed and Dexter was taught to believe, was not possible. He thinks about it with full awareness of what he is doing. He is not deceiving himself the way Harry perhaps deceived himself about what the code actually was. He can see himself from the outside. He knows he is considering reproducing the pattern, and he considers it anyway, because it is the only model he has. You can only give what you were given. This is generational trauma in its philosophical essence. Not a simple repetition of abuse, not cruelty masquerading as parenting, but a genuinely well-intentioned person reproducing the only framework they know how to offer, even when they can see clearly that the framework damaged them. Understanding a harmful pattern, knowing it intellectually, recognizing it from the outside, is not the same as having the resources to stop it. Dexter knows what Harry did. He understands the philosophical and psychological cost of having a code installed rather than developed through one's own reflection and choice, and he still finds himself drawing the same blueprint. The developmental psychologist and psychoanalyst Daniel Stern spent decades studying how early relational patterns transmit between generations. The work that grew from his research and the broader tradition of developmental psychology he contributed to holds a consistent and heartbreaking observation that parents tend to reproduce the relational patterns they received, not the ones they wish they had received. The gap between knowing better and doing better is one of the most consistent features of human parenting across cultures and circumstances. It is not a failure of love. It is a failure of available resources, of the models and alternatives that would need to exist in order for something different to be possible. The show's ending, Harrison shooting Dexter at Dexter's own request with Dexter's own gun, is among other things an answer to the question of whether Dexter can transmit something other than the pattern. He cannot stop being what he is. He cannot be a father without also being a monster, and he cannot guarantee that what his son has inherited will not eventually express itself in the same direction that his own inheritance expressed itself. And so, in the clearest and most final way available to him, he removes himself from the equation. He asks Harrison to end the cycle at its source rather than carry it forward. Whether this is love or one last act of control depends on how you read Dexter by this point in his arc. I think it is both simultaneously. He is being driven by genuine love for Harrison, a genuine reading of the situation that is probably accurate, an honest understanding that his continued presence in Harrison's life will eventually cost Harrison something that cannot be recovered. And he is also, characteristically, choosing the terms. Choosing who holds the gun and where and why and how the scene ends. Control has always been Dexter's most fundamental need. Even in what is meant to be surrender, he is still arranging the staging. But then Dexter. Resurrection reveals that he survived the gunshot, that Harrison did not, after all, deliver the final page of the story, which complicates the reading of New Blood's finale significantly and raises questions the franchise has not yet fully answered as of early 2026. What I think remains true, regardless of how Resurrection eventually resolves things, is the philosophical core of what Harrison's arc establishes. Darkness is not destiny. Brian Moser and Dexter Morgan came from the same container and became different things. The show's treatment of Harrison's self-harm deserves a moment of careful attention because the show handles it with more restraint than it might have, given the franchise's general comfort with graphic content. Harrison's cutting is not shown extensively or with anything like the visual elaboration the show gives to Dexter's kills. It is revealed and then handled as a fact about Harrison's interior life rather than as a spectacle. And this restraint is philosophically appropriate because what the cutting represents is not performance. It is the opposite of performance. It is a private management strategy, something Harrison does when the ordinary world is not adequate to contain whatever is happening inside him. Dexter recognizes this immediately because he recognizes the grammar of it. Not the specific content, he does not cut himself, but the underlying structure. The private ritual that creates a contained space for something that would otherwise be uncontainable. The chosen pain as a form of control in situations where everything else feels uncontrollable. The philosopher Paul Ricoeur, writing about narrative identity and the way that people make themselves coherent through the stories they tell about themselves, observe that personal identity is always a narrative project. We are not simply what we are. We are the story we tell about what we are, the way we connect our past to our present, and project ourselves into a future that makes some kind of sense. Without a coherent narrative, identity becomes fragmentary and difficult to sustain. Harrison has no coherent narrative about himself. He does not know his father. He does not fully know his own history. He has been passed between situations without a story that connects them into something that makes sense. The cutting is, in Ricoeur's terms, a narrative collapse, a moment when the story fails to hold, and something more immediate and more physical is required to create a sense of boundary and self. Dexter's code has always functioned, in part, as a narrative for him, a story about who he is and why what he does means something. Harrison has no code yet. The question New Blood is asking, underneath everything else it is asking, is whether Harrison will find a different narrative before the vacuum pulls him in the direction his biology and his history are pointing. Harrison does not have to become what Dexter is. But in order for something different to be possible, he needs to be seen clearly and helped honestly and given a model that is actually different from the one Dexter was given. Settle in. From here, the conversation slows down even further, and we are going to stay in the quieter spaces for the rest of the evening. The show's treatment of Harrison's self-harm deserves a moment of careful attention because the show handles it with more restraint than it might have, given the franchise's general comfort with graphic content. Harrison's cutting is not shown extensively or with anything like the visual elaboration the show gives to Dexter's kills. It is revealed and then handled as a fact about Harrison's interior life rather than as a spectacle. And this restraint is philosophically appropriate because what the cutting represents is not performance. It is the opposite of performance. It is a private management strategy, something Harrison does when the ordinary world is not adequate to contain whatever is happening inside him. Dexter recognizes this immediately because he recognizes the grammar of it, not the specific content. He does not cut himself, but the underlying structure. The private ritual that creates a contained space for something that would otherwise be uncontainable. The chosen pain as a form of control in situations where everything else feels uncontrollable. The philosopher Paul Ricoeur, writing about narrative identity and the way that people make themselves coherent through the stories they tell about themselves, observed that personal identity is always a narrative project. We are not simply what we are. We are the story we tell about what we are, the way we connect our past to our present and project ourselves into a future that makes some kind of sense. Without a coherent narrative, identity becomes fragmentary and difficult to sustain. Harrison has no coherent narrative about himself. He does not know his father. He does not fully know his own history. He has been passed between situations without a story that connects them into something that makes sense. The cutting is, in Ricoeur's terms, a narrative collapse, a moment when the story fails to hold and something more immediate and more physical is required to create a sense of boundary and self. Dexter's code has always functioned, in part, as a narrative for him. A story about who he is and why what he does means something. Harrison has no code yet. The question New Blood is asking, underneath everything else it's asking, is whether Harrison will find a different narrative before the vacuum pulls him in the direction his biology and his history are pointing. The code as religion, ritual, meaning, and the sacred. In A Secular Killer, Dexter does not believe in God. The show makes this clear early and maintains it consistently. He does not pray. He does not find comfort in religious frameworks. He does not reach for faith when things fall apart. He is, by his own assessment and by any observable measure, someone for whom that particular category of experience simply does not exist. And yet his life is organized around ritual with a precision and a devotion that most religious practitioners would find familiar. The kill ritual is extraordinarily specific. The process begins weeks or sometimes months before the actual kill, with research and surveillance and the careful accumulation of evidence that reaches the standard of guilt the code requires. It cannot be rushed. Dexter is a meticulous researcher. He uses his access to police databases and his forensic expertise to build a case that meets his own internal criteria before he allows himself to proceed. Then comes the preparation of the space, the kill room, wherever it is going to be. The plastic wrap laid with care over every surface, not just for practical reasons, but in a way that looks, from the right angle, like the preparation of an altar. Then the confrontation with the victim, which follows its own internal script. The photographs of what they have done displayed on the wall. The acknowledgement of their guilt, the cheek sliced with a scalpel for the blood slide. Then the kill. Then the disposal at sea, from the boat named Slice of Life, in the dark and the water that receives everything Dexter brings to it without complaint or record. And finally the blood slide, a single drop of the victim's blood captured between two pieces of glass, placed in the collection box, returned to its hiding place behind the air conditioning unit in Dexter's apartment. One more small red circle joining the ones before it, the collection growing by one. None of this is necessary for the practical purpose of killing someone. None of it makes the kill significantly safer or more difficult to trace. The plastic wrap has a practical function in containment, but the ritual around it goes far beyond any practical requirement. This is what philosophers and anthropologists would call supererogatory behavior, behavior that goes beyond what the situation requires. And it is precisely this supererogatory quality, this going beyond the necessary, that marks the ritual as something more than procedure. The sociologist Emile Durkheim, writing in the early 20th century, made an argument about religion that was, for its time, radical in its implications. He argued that religion is not fundamentally about God. It is about the distinction between the sacred and the profane. The sacred is that which is set apart from ordinary experience, which is treated with special reverence, which is surrounded by ritual that marks it as categorically different from everything else. The profane is the ordinary, the everyday, the transactional. God, in this framework, is a particular way of organizing the sacred, one way among others. But the sacred can exist without God. It can be organized around almost anything, a mountain, a flag, a building, a practice, as long as the person or the community treats it with the appropriate reverence. By Durkheim's definition, Dexter's kill ritual is religious behavior. He has made the kill sacred, not morally good, not philosophically justified in any clean sense, but sacred in the specific technical sense that it's set apart from ordinary life, surrounded by ritual that cannot be abbreviated without violating something important, and treated with a seriousness and a care that nothing else in Dexter's life receives. The blood slides are relics. In religious traditions, relics are physical objects that retain the spiritual significance of a sacred event or person. They are preserved, protected, hidden from ordinary exposure. Dexter's blood slides function exactly this way. They are the physical residue of events he has treated as sacred. He keeps them with the attentiveness of a custodian who understands what he holds. When they are discovered or threatened in Season 2, when his secret begins to surface under the Bay Harbor butcher investigation, the threat to the slides carries an urgency that goes beyond their evidentiary danger. It feels like desecration, like an intrusion into something that was supposed to remain inviolable. What the code provides, and what religion classically provides, is a framework that transforms otherwise meaningless or chaotic experience into something structured and significant. Religion does not eliminate difficulty. It does not make the hard things easy or the sad things happy. What it does is give experience a shape, a narrative, a set of rules that connect what happened yesterday to what is happening today and what will happen tomorrow. It makes a life into something more coherent than a sequence of unrelated events. The moral framework that organizes Dexter's entire existence was written by a man who was destroyed by what he had written. And yet the code persists. Dexter does not abandon it when he learns this. He cannot. Which is, if you think about it, exactly how most religious and moral traditions survive the failures and contradictions of their founding moments. The foundation turns out to be complicated and human and imperfect, and the practitioners continue anyway, because what was built on that foundation has become something they cannot abandon without abandoning themselves. The code is not Harry's anymore, it is Dexter's. The practice has become the practitioner. The second theological blow, Vogel's revelation that she co-designed the code as a clinical experiment, strips the sacred origin story down to something bureaucratic and instrumental. And still, the code continues. Because by Season 8, the code is not a tribute to Harry or an instrument of Vogel's research. It is the shape of Dexter's life. The ritual is the only container he has. Remove it, and there's nothing left that he can recognize as a self. There is something in this worth sitting with quietly. The structures we build around our lives, the rituals and the codes and the frameworks that give experience a shape, often outlast the reasons they were created. They persist because they have become load-bearing, because the life that grew up inside them cannot stand without them, even when the original foundation turns out to have been different from what we were told. Dexter cannot stop, not because he is helpless. The Narcotics Anonymous meetings that Dexter attends in Season 2 are worth pausing on specifically, because they are the closest the show comes to letting Dexter speak without a filter, without calibration, without the performance of what a normal person would say in this context. He attends the meetings as a cover story. His sponsor, his NA contact, his attendance at the meetings, all of it is part of the explanation he and Deborah construct for his behavior during the Bay Harbor butcher investigation. He needs to look like someone with a substance problem getting help rather than someone being investigated by federal agents. The meetings are a prop, and yet what he says in the meetings is more honest than almost anything he says anywhere else in his life. He describes the dark passenger using language that the people in the room understand in their own terms as a metaphor for compulsion and addiction. He talks about the way the passenger makes him feel alive, the way nothing else provides the same quality of presence, the way connection and feeling are bundled together in the one thing he cannot stop doing and cannot fully admit to. He says in the second season that he cannot imagine that the dark part of himself could ever love him. He wonders if the connection he feels, the thing that might be connection, might be something the dark passenger is telling him to make, stopping seem even less possible. This is extraordinarily self-aware language for a character who is, nominally, not self-aware about his compulsions. And I think what it reveals is that Dexter does have access to something like insight when the context strips away the requirement to perform. The NA meetings require honesty of a kind, even when the specific content is being translated through a metaphor. And in that space of required honesty, something comes out that the rest of the performance suppresses. The meetings function in the show's structure the way religious confession functions in traditions that practice it. Not as a space for resolution, but as a space where the thing that cannot be spoken openly can be spoken in a form that the community understands and accepts without requiring the specific truth to be named. The meeting does not fix anything. but it provides a container for the thing that otherwise has no container. Dexter does not go back to the meetings after season 2. He does not need the cover story anymore. But I wonder sometimes what the show might have looked like if he had kept going, if the meetings had become something other than a prop. Whether a consistent space of translated honesty might have done something over time that the code alone could not. But because stopping would require building something else to stand in the place of what was there, and he has never had the tools for that kind of construction. Deborah Morgan, the human anchor and what it costs her. Deborah Morgan is the moral center of Dexter. Not Dexter. This is easy to miss because the show is structured entirely from Dexter's point of view, told through his voice, filtered through his interior monologue. He is the protagonist in every formal sense. But Deborah is the character through whom the show measures everything else. She is the one whose arc tells us what Dexter actually costs. Not in abstract philosophical terms, but in the specific, daily, cumulative cost to a person who loves him without reservation and has never had the option of not loving him. She begins the series as a vice officer, foul-mouthed and ambitious, and fiercely loyal to her adoptive brother in the uncomplicated way that siblings who grew up in the same house with the same parents and the same history can love each other. She does not know what Dexter is. She knows that he is strange, that his affect is sometimes slightly off in ways she cannot quite articulate, that he relates to the world in ways that occasionally make her look at him sideways without being able to name what she is seeing. But she loves him, fully and without condition. The show takes that love and, over 8 seasons, uses it to demonstrate exactly what happens to a person who loves without reservation someone who is not safe to love. Deborah's arc is a story about moral contamination. The concept comes from moral psychology, and it describes the process by which exposure to wrongdoing, even indirect or unwilling exposure, changes a person's moral profile over time. When you know about something terrible and choose not to act against it, you become implicated in it. Not to the same degree as the person who committed the wrong, not with the same culpability, but implicated nonetheless. Your moral landscape has changed. You are no longer the person you were before you knew. The knowledge has done something to you that cannot be undone. Deborah becomes implicated in Dexter's life gradually and in stages, each one making the next more possible. First, she knows what he is. That is the initial contamination, the one she did not choose and could not have anticipated. Then she tries to manage the knowledge, to find a way to live with it that involves some form of ongoing control over what Dexter does, some guardrail between knowing and enabling. Then, in the season 7 finale, the line between knowing and enabling disappears entirely. She does not simply watch him kill, she kills herself to protect him, putting a bullet through Lagerta in the shipping containers on the waterfront. The shooting of Lagerta is the show's most morally serious moment, not because it is the most violent, there is more explicit violence elsewhere, but because it is the moment when the cost of loving Dexter is fully externalized onto someone who had nothing to do with it. Lagerta was not Dexter's victim in any meaningful sense. She was a detective doing her job. She was right about what she suspected. And she is dead because the person who loved Dexter most could not allow the correct conclusion to reach its correct outcome. The show is very clear about what this costs Deborah in the seasons that follow. She does not find a way to carry the weight of Lagerta's death with anything resembling equilibrium. She drinks. She makes choices that damage her relationships and her career and her sense of herself. She is self-destructing in the slow, almost undramatic way that is harder to watch than the fast, dramatic kind because it does not resolve and it does not peak. It just continues day by day, a person gradually becoming less themselves. This is what moral contamination does in practice. Not necessarily punishment from outside, not necessarily consequence delivered by the world, but the internal erosion of someone who has acted against their own deepest values for someone they love and cannot find a way back to the person they were before. What makes Deborah's arc philosophically interesting rather than simply tragic is the question it poses about love and moral responsibility. Deborah loves Dexter. This is not in question anywhere in the series, but her love for him has not been good for her, and when examined clearly, it has not been good for him either. It has enabled his continued operation, it has provided cover, it has given him someone whose moral judgment he can occasionally borrow when his own fails. someone who provides the human connection that makes his performed normalcy more convincing. The philosopher Nell Noddings, writing about the ethics of care, argued that care is most morally valuable when it is reciprocal. When both parties in a caring relationship are genuinely attending to the needs of the other, and when the care flows in both directions with some degree of balance over time. Dexter's care for Deborah is real but limited, and in its ultimate effect, largely one-directional. He cares about her well-being in the moment. He does not take responsibility for the structural features of their relationship that are consistently harmful to her. He keeps his secret from her for years, not primarily to protect her from painful knowledge, though he tells himself this, but to protect himself from the complications that her knowing would create. He allows her to remain ignorant of something that profoundly affects her life, makes decisions for her about what she is capable of knowing and handling, because her ignorance is functionally convenient for him. This is care as management rather than care as genuine regard. When she finally knows and can no longer be kept at the comfortable distance of ignorance, the care that should have been present from the beginning finally has to be acknowledged directly, and it is too late. She has already paid the price of a secret that was never hers to carry. Dexter's disconnection of Deborah's life support in the Season 8 finale, his carrying her body from the hospital to the slice of life and releasing her into the ocean, is an image the show holds for a long time without allowing any easy emotional resolution. He gives her the burial he gives his victims. The most beloved person in his life ends in the same water as everyone he has killed. The person he loved most ends in the same place as the people whose blood slides he kept behind the air conditioning unit. I do not think the show intends this as symmetry in any simple sense. I think it means it as confession, as the most honest thing Dexter has ever done. He knows what he is. He knows what loving him cost her. He gives her to the water because it is the only language for grief he has, and because giving her to the water is giving her to the only place he has ever been fully himself. Wherever you are tonight, I hope that lands gently. It is one of the heaviest things in the show, and it deserves to be felt rather than explained past too quickly. The Narcotics Anonymous meetings that Dexter attends in Season 2 are worth pausing on specifically, because they are the closest the show comes to letting Dexter speak without a filter, without calibration, without the performance of what a normal person would say in this context. He attends the meetings as a cover story. His sponsor, his NA contact, his attendance at the meetings, all of it is part of the explanation he and Deborah construct for his behavior during the Bay Harbor Butcher investigation. He needs to look like someone with a substance problem getting help rather than someone being investigated by federal agents. The meetings are a prop. And yet what he says in the meetings is more honest than almost anything he says anywhere else in his life. He describes the dark passenger using language that the people in the room understand in their own terms as a metaphor for compulsion and addiction. He talks about the way the passenger makes him feel alive, the way nothing else provides the same quality of presence, the way connection and feeling are bundled together in the one thing he cannot stop doing and cannot fully admit to. He says in the second season that he cannot imagine that the dark part of himself could ever love him. He wonders if the connection he feels, the thing that might be connection, might be something the dark passenger is telling him to make stopping seem even less possible. This is extraordinarily self-aware language for a character who is nominally not self-aware about his compulsions. And I think what it reveals is that Dexter does have access to something like insight when the context strips away the requirement to perform. The NA meetings require honesty of a kind, even when the specific content is being translated through a metaphor. And in that space of required honesty, something comes out that the rest of the performance suppresses. The meetings function, in the show's structure, the way religious confession functions in traditions that practice it. Not as a space for resolution, but as a space where the thing that cannot be spoken openly can be spoken in a form that the community understands and accepts without requiring the specific truth to be named. The meeting does not fix anything, but it provides a container for the thing that otherwise has no container. Dexter does not go back to the meetings after Season 2. He does not need the cover story anymore. But I wonder sometimes what the show might have looked like if he had kept going, if the meetings had become something other than a prop, whether a consistent space of translated honesty might have done something over time that the code alone could not. The lumberjack ending and the problem of escape. The original ending of Dexter, broadcast in September 2013 at the conclusion of the 8th and final season, is one of the most debated series finales in American television history. The conversation around it has been almost entirely about satisfaction, about whether the ending earned what it was trying to do, about whether it was the right conclusion for a character who had been built up over nearly a decade of increasingly complex storytelling. But I think the more interesting conversation, the one that holds up better over time, is not about satisfaction. It is about what the ending is actually saying philosophically. What it believes about the relationship between guilt and exile, between accountability and disappearance, between the life Dexter built and the responsibility he owes to the people that life destroyed. What happens at the conclusion of Season 8? Deborah has suffered a fatal stroke following a gunshot wound she sustained during the final confrontation with the brain surgeon. She is on life support with no possibility of meaningful recovery. Dexter, who had been in the final stages of planning to flee to Argentina with Hannah McKay and his son Harrison, makes a series of rapid decisions. He disconnects Deborah from life support. He carries her body from the hospital to his boat. He takes her out to the water and releases her. He drives the boat toward a hurricane making landfall off the Florida coast. And then, months later, in what was presented as the final image of the series, we see Dexter alive in a remote location in the Pacific Northwest, bearded and isolated, working as a lumberjack. He has sent Harrison away to Argentina with Hannah. He is alone. He is surviving. He is not dead. The philosophical problem with this ending does not begin with the question of whether it is dramatically satisfying. It begins with the question of what exile is supposed to accomplish. In most ethical traditions, and this is true across cultures and philosophical systems that would disagree on almost everything else, punishment requires some form of connection to the wrong that was done. Exile, self-imposed isolation, disappearance into the woods, only functions as a morally meaningful response to wrongdoing if the wrongdoing is witnessed, if the connection between the harm done and the consequence imposed is legible to the people who were harmed. You cannot do penance in invisible ink. Penance requires acknowledgement, which requires presence. Dexter's lumberjack exile is invisible. The world believes he drove his boat into a hurricane and died. The families of the people he killed over 2 decades receive nothing. The people who cared about him receive a death that is not a death, a grief with no object. The investigators who might have continued looking for answers receive instead a closed case and a body never recovered. The consequence he is supposedly enduring is real only to him, and even to him it is self-chosen and self-administered and completely outside the reach of anyone who might have a claim on it. This is not penance, this is management. This is a very intelligent and very damaged person arranging their own consequences in a way that minimizes external accountability, while providing the appearance, at least to themselves, of having paid something. Albert Camus, writing in The Myth of Sisyphus in 1942, offered a response to a different but related problem. What do you do with the knowledge that what you are doing is futile? His answer was not to stop. His answer was to go back down the mountain, to engage fully with the futility rather than seeking escape from it. The authentic response to an impossible situation is not to find the exit. It is to keep doing the work with full awareness of what it is without pretending it is other than it is. Dexter's Season 8 ending is the opposite of this in almost every way. He finds the exit, he takes it, he pretends to die in a hurricane and builds himself a smaller life in the woods where the consequences of the larger life cannot reach him. This is the final and most elaborate form of avoidance in a character whose entire arc has been built from avoidance. He has been avoiding accountability and avoiding self-knowledge and avoiding the full weight of what he is and what he has done since the first episode. The Lumberjack in the Woods is the logical conclusion of all that avoiding. It is Dexter in a cabin, which is just Dexter in a kill room with no table. This is, I think, why the franchise could not leave it there. Not simply because the audience was unsatisfied, though the audience clearly was, but because the show itself, taken seriously as a philosophical and dramatic argument, had not finished the argument it started. Something was unresolved that a story set 8 years later, about a son who inherited the damage and a father who could not outrun himself, might be able to resolve. New Blood does not simply revisit the ending. It rejects it structurally. It says, through its own plot, that running does not work, that what you are follows you, not primarily because the world eventually tracks you down, though in New Blood, the world does eventually track Dexter down, but because you are the thing that is running. Jim Lindsay is not a new person. He is Dexter Morgan with a different name and a smaller territory and no less capacity for what he has always been capable of. He has not changed. He has relocated. Harrison arrives in Iron Lake and the relocation stops being viable, not because Harrison immediately forces a confrontation, but because Dexter cannot perform a complete life in front of his son the way he performed one in front of everyone else in Miami. The stakes are different. The person watching is someone who deserves something closer to truth, and Dexter finds, to his own surprise perhaps, that he cannot maintain the same distance. Whether Dexter, resurrection ultimately serves or undermines the resolution New Blood provided is a question the franchise has not yet fully answered. What is confirmed as of early 2026 is that Dexter survived the gunshot Harrison fired in the New Blood finale. The question of what survival means in the context of Dexter's arc is philosophically more interesting than it might initially appear. In New Blood, Dexter's decision to ask Harrison to shoot him is framed as a form of love, as the final, most honest act of a father who loves his son enough to remove himself from the son's future. This reading depends entirely on the finality of the act. If Dexter dies, then Harrison's act of pulling the trigger is the thing it was presented as. A conclusion, a closure, the end of the cycle rather than its continuation. If Dexter survives, as Resurrection indicates, then Harrison's act is something different. It is not a conclusion. It is another event in an ongoing story. Harrison did not end anything. He participated in what might have been just another episode in a life that has been generating episodes for decades. The son did not liberate himself from the father's inheritance. He fired a gun and the father walked away from it. This does not necessarily mean New Blood's ending is undermined. It might mean, depending on what Resurrection does with the survival, that Dexter's survival is itself the philosophical statement. That even asking to be killed, even consenting to the shot, even engineering the scene as carefully as he engineered every kill room, is not the same as actually being able to stop. That the will to end things and the ability to actually end them are, for Dexter, different things. The existentialist philosopher Simone de Beauvoir, writing about the ethics of ambiguity, argued that human freedom is always situated, always constrained by circumstances, by relationships, by the embodied reality of being a specific person in a specific world. Pure freedom, freedom unconstrained by anything, does not exist. What exists is the negotiation between what you want and what your situation allows. Dexter wants to end. He has wanted to end in different forms since the suicide attempt in season 2. And yet he keeps not ending. He keeps surviving. He keeps generating new episodes. This might be a narrative failure, a franchise unable to let go of a profitable character. Or it might be, read charitably, the show's most honest philosophical statement. That wanting to stop being what you are is not sufficient. That even the most elaborate forms of arranged conclusion can be survived. That the self is more persistent than any single gesture of renunciation. Whether Resurrection earns this reading is a question it will have to answer for itself, which complicates the sacrificial reading of that ending considerably. Whether the survival is a creative extension of the story or an undoing of its conclusion depends on what Resurrection does with it. What I think holds regardless is the philosophical argument New Blood was making. Running is not resolution. Exile is not penance. The question of accountability, of what a person owes to the world for what they have taken from it, does not dissolve in the Pacific Northwest air. It follows you. It is patient. And when the thing you were running from finally arrives, in whatever form it arrives in, you find that you have not actually been somewhere else. You have been carrying it the whole time. What Dexter Morgan teaches us about being human. We have spent a long time tonight with Dexter Morgan, with his hollow place and his inherited code, and his dark passenger and the complicated, costly people who loved him, with his rituals and his blood-slides and the water he kept returning to, with the philosophical questions his existence raises and the philosophical questions it refuses to answer. I want to spend these last few minutes as the evening settles around you thinking about what any of it has to do with us. With ordinary lives and ordinary damage and the ordinary human project of trying to be good when being good is not entirely clear and doing it consistently is harder than it looks. Because I think it does have something to do with us. I think that is why the show lasted as long as it did and why people came back to it across so many years and why we are here together tonight, talking about a fictional serial killer from Miami as though he is someone worth taking seriously. He is worth taking seriously. Not because serial killers are admirable or because the show endorses anything Dexter does, but because the questions his character embodies, stripped of the extreme and specific context of his life, are questions that real people carry in quieter and less dramatic forms through ordinary experience. The first and most important thing Dexter teaches us is that being told who you are is not the same as being who you are. Harry gave Dexter an identity before Dexter could construct one himself. The code was imposed, not chosen. The shape of Dexter's life was determined by someone else's reading of what he was and what he was going to become. A reading made by a loving person who was probably trying to help. A reading that may not even have been wrong about the specific facts, but that arrived before Dexter could participate in the reading. And Dexter lived inside that determination for decades, following rules he did not write, being the person he was told he was and calling it a self. Most of us, in less extreme and less dramatic ways, have a version of this experience. We are told who we are by families and cultures and religious traditions and institutions before we are old enough to evaluate what we are being told. We absorb definitions of good and bad and appropriate and possible before we have the capacity to interrogate those definitions. Dexter's tragedy is the extreme version of a very human problem. The distance between the self you were given and the self you might have found if the giving had been delayed long enough for you to participate in it. The second thing Dexter teaches us is that intelligence is not the same as wisdom, and that the gap between them can be a very large and a very costly gap. He is, within the show's logic, the smartest person in most rooms he enters. He is a genuine expert in his field, a sophisticated analyst of physical evidence and human behavior, a tactician of remarkable capability. And none of this intelligence touches the thing that is actually wrong with his life. He cannot think his way out of his loneliness. He cannot analyze his way through his grief. He cannot construct a better philosophical framework for his psychological pain and then install it in himself through force of understanding. The things that would actually help him, honest connection, sustained therapeutic work, the kind of slow and unglamorous self-examination that might gradually produce something different, require not intelligence, but vulnerability. And vulnerability is the one resource that his history and his training and his philosophy have systematically depleted across decades of careful and deliberate management. We live in a world that treats intelligence as the highest virtue. We optimize for it, celebrate it, assume without examining the assumption that being smarter makes things better. Dexter is a sustained argument against this assumption. Being smart enough to understand your damage with great precision is not the same as being equipped to address it. Understanding the mechanisms of your own avoidance does not automatically enable you to stop avoiding. These are different capacities, and they require different kinds of cultivation. The third thing Dexter teaches us is that the people we love pay the price of what we are not willing to examine in ourselves. Deborah's arc is not, at its core, a story about loving a serial killer. It is a story about what happens when you love someone who uses your love as a resource without taking responsibility for what that costs you. The damage Deborah sustains is not because Dexter is a killer. It is because he is not honest with her about what he is and what the proximity to him will mean for her life. Because he withholds the truth that would allow her to make an informed decision about how close to stand. Because his need to be protected consistently overrides his responsibility to extend that protection outward to the people who love him. This is true at a scale much smaller than serial killing. The person who refuses to examine their own damage, who allows the people around them to bear the cost of the damage without acknowledgement or accountability, is doing something structurally similar to what Dexter does, not with the same stakes, not with the same deliberateness, but in the same direction. The fourth thing, and the one I want to leave you with tonight, is about the question that Dexter keeps asking and that the show refuses to answer. Can I be good? And what does good actually mean? Dexter asks this question in almost every episode. Sometimes he phrases it as whether he is capable of feeling, sometimes as whether the code is enough, sometimes as whether he can be a father or a brother or a person in the world without eventually destroying the thing he is trying to be part of. He never receives a definitive answer. The show does not provide one for him. 8 seasons of television and multiple spin-offs have not resolved the question. I think that is right. I think the question of whether we can be good is not the kind of question that gets answered once and filed away. It is the kind of question that gets lived. You answer it through choices, one at a time, imperfectly, with full awareness that some of those choices will be wrong and that being wrong has consequences that may not be correctable. Dexter makes this kind of choice constantly, across decades, for reasons that are partially his responsibility and partially the responsibility of what was done to him, and partially just the ordinary human condition of being damaged and trying to act anyway with the resources that remain. What makes him worth spending an evening with, worth thinking about slowly and carefully on a quiet night, is not that he gets it right. He does not get it right. He gets it wrong repeatedly and at great cost to himself and to everyone around him. What makes him worth the time is that he keeps turning toward the question, even when the question costs him everything, even when the answer is not available and has never been available. He keeps asking it. And I think most of us, in our quieter and less cinematic way, do the same thing. We keep asking whether we are good enough. We keep checking the gap between who we are and who we meant to be. We keep trying to do better with the equipment we have, which is imperfect equipment built from imperfect materials by people who were working from their own imperfect blueprints. Dexter is an extreme. He is a thought experiment stretched over 8 seasons and a cast of hundreds. The show's relationship to grief is worth noting as we close, because it is one of the more under-examined aspects of what makes Dexter's philosophical content feel genuine rather than merely constructed. Dexter grieves across the series in ways that do not resolve cleanly and that the code does not account for. He grieves Harry eventually, including the version of Harry he thought he had. He grieves Rita in season 5 in ways that are quiet and unglamorous, and not at all what grief looks like in television that wants grief to be dramatic and legible. He grieves his own first life, the one from his original dimension, so to speak, the version of himself who might have been possible if the container had not happened or if Harry had made different choices. And he grieves Deborah at the end in the most complete and inarticulate way the show can find, which is to give her to the ocean and to drive into the storm. Grief, philosophically, is the feeling that attaches to the loss of something you valued. It is, in this sense, evidence of value. You cannot grieve something that did not matter to you. Dexter's grief is evidence of the attachments that his philosophy says he should not be forming. The hollow place he describes in the first episode is not, it turns out, empty. It is full of losses he is not supposed to feel. This is what makes the question of whether he can love not purely an intellectual question. The grief answers it, partially, in the only direction that matters, not through introspection or self-report, through the fact of it, through the weight it carries, through the way it shows up in the episodes that follow each loss, present and unresolved, declining to be processed away by whatever distraction or adventure or kill comes next. He grieves, and grief, as much as any philosophical argument, is proof of connection. But the questions underneath the extreme are ordinary questions, the hollow place inside, the code someone else gave you, the passenger you eventually have to learn to drive yourself, the people you love whose love you have not been careful enough with. These are not the questions of a serial killer. These are the questions of someone trying to understand what they are and whether what they are is enough. Wherever you are tonight, I hope this was a comfortable way to wind down. I hope the questions sat with you gently, the way good questions do when there is no urgency to answer them, and the night is long enough to just let them be. If you enjoyed spending this evening thinking about Dexter Morgan, a subscription is always appreciated. It helps this channel keep making exactly these kinds of videos. In future videos, I would love to spend time specifically with Deborah Morgan's art, season by season, from the first episode to the finale, because she deserves her own evening. Her story is worth telling on its own terms, and I think it is one of the most under-examined arcs in the franchise. And there is a video to be made about Harry Morgan alone, the man who built the code and then could not live with what the code produced, the father who shaped his son so precisely and so permanently that the shaping outlasted the Father's own willingness to exist alongside it. If either of those sounds like a good evening to you, I will see you then. For now, the dark passenger can rest. Sweet dreams.